It is my deep honor to welcome you to our conference this year, which is Southeast Asia, Regional Dynamics, and International Linkages. As many of you know, the Asia Center sees growing Southeast Asia as one of its absolutely primary goals. The idea here is Harvard has sadly really not developed Southeast Asian studies. We see the Asia Center as the perfect place to nurture Southeast Asian studies, building a study of the languages, bringing in faculty to study Southeast Asia, hosting events to generate more interest, and hopefully creating a home for all of you as we explore Southeast Asia together. We also hope to do so in building upon what we would like to think we at the Asia Center have been doing very well now for a while, which is always thinking in broader terms. How do we bring different disciplines together in the study of Southeast Asia? How do we look at linkages of Southeast Asia through the rest of the world? How do we rethink our understanding of the rest of the world once we are taking Southeast Asia seriously? In other words, building upon what we have done with the Asia Center in general and focusing now on Southeast Asia. In order for this to be possible, of course, it requires the extraordinary work of a number of people. I won't embarrass all of them, but I'm going to embarrass some. However, don't worry, I'm not looking there yet, James. So let me begin with the immediate person who has been absolutely instrumental in developing this entire conference. You all have been hearing endless emails from him because he is on top of everything. Jorge Espada, who has been amazing. So Jorge, on top of doing this conference, is really in charge of the entire Southeast Asia initiative. So you've gotten a portrait of what, in general, Jorge is doing, and he's been an absolutely extraordinary figure in this. A huge thanks as well to Rachel Walsh, our new executive director, who has been instrumental in rethinking the staffing and finances of the Asia Center to maintain this focus on Southeast Asia. So Rachel, thank you so much. Our entire Asia Center staff has been absolutely extraordinary. You've had a chance to meet several of them just by walking into the door, getting our coffee, getting your badges, and you'll meet many others throughout the entire day. They are extraordinary. Sadly for him, one of them made the mistake of being within my gaze. The others wisely knew to stay away. So the one poor person who is right here that we can embarrass horribly is Tenzin, who has been amazing. Thank you. Oh, yes. You thought you had escaped. And when, not just for this conference, but in truth, for everything going on at the Asia Center, Southeast Asia related, and everything else, we have an amazing communications director who is bringing everything to our attention with these beautiful posters, always incredibly well done. So, no, I'm going to embarrass you further. And also, you'll be eating delicious foods throughout the day here, and I hope many of you will return repeatedly to our events. Those too are catered by the same exact person who is amazing at sort of learning what are the different catering areas throughout the greater Boston area, who can do well with Indonesian food, who can do well with Tibetan food. She has been absolutely extraordinary. And she foolishly did come to the auditorium, so let us embarrass her horribly as well. Thank you so much for all that you are doing. Thank you so much. And then I'm on a roll. So the person who was indeed upstairs giving you the badges and things, since she wisely isn't here, but nonetheless in absentia, I'll embarrass her too. So Julie Story has been absolutely instrumental in really running so much of the Asia Center, very much including this conference. So in absentia, we'll embarrass her too. So yes, indeed. The one person who foolishly thinks that he has escaped my embarrassing calls is the figure who for the past 5 years has been absolutely crucial in doing much of the work I just mentioned, in really saying, how do we build Southeast Asian studies at Harvard? Where do we begin? What if we focus, to give an obvious example, because it's been so successful, on languages, getting the funding for the key languages, that way bringing in students, that will build support for more faculty positions, that in turn will allow us to build yet more and more, ultimately creating, we hope in the long run, a Center for Southeast Asian Studies, departmental homes for all of the faculty, and he has been absolutely instrumental in doing this. So James Robson, thank you for all that you've been doing for us.
record straight, Michael. So basically, if anything got started here related to the Southeast Asia initiative, it was basically working with Jorge.
Yes.
And the endless messages we were writing to provosts, to deans, to the president's office, getting a no every single time. And then we realized they probably weren't reading things. So Jorge developed a way to visualize things in these incredible charts and stuff. So, and basically all we did was bring together faculty at Harvard. We realized there were actually tons of resources here. They're all in the room here. Enzo sitting here, Todd, Annette, Jay, Sugata. Who else is Taryn? Probably others I'm not even seeing, but it was really just bringing together all those resources, which are the faculty that are now driving it. And then I would just say on behalf of them, we are thankful that you have picked up the keep going. So anyway, just to set the record straight.
But James was the one that organized this. However, I will underline one of the points he made, which is precisely one of the goals that he and Jorge did, was to look around Harvard and say, even though Harvard has never built a Southeast Asia program, which is our goal, nonetheless, it has hired a lot of people throughout Harvard concerned with Southeast Asia who have never had a home, and their vision was to say, let us have Asia Center be that home, let us bring them together, let us create what we now call a Southeast Asian faculty working group that thinks through how to organize conferences, how to develop events, long-range planning of how to get funding for different languages, what languages to focus on when, how ultimately to bring in faculty positions. So since James has already embarrassed them, I will simply throw out a general thank you to the entire Southeast Asia faculty working group. You've all been amazing. Thank you. Now, you'll be happy to hear, well, those of you who have not yet been embarrassed horribly will be happy to hear I'm not going to embarrass any more people. The one thing I do want to say is move to a somewhat sad note, which is I would like to dedicate this conference to two great friends of the Asia Center who have passed away recently. Carter Eckert passed away. He was an amazing friend of the Asia Center. He really built Korean studies at Harvard, has been an inspiration for us in doing the same with Southeast Asian studies, and was just an extraordinary friend of the Asia Center, incredibly dedicated to what we are doing. The second one is William Overholt, who has been just an extraordinary supporter and visionary for the Asia Center, very much including the focus on Southeast Asia. He too has passed away, and I would like us all to dedicate this conference to the memory of these two extraordinary figures, and we will pledge to continue the great work that they have been doing, to continue the great vision that they brought to the Asia Center, and we are committed to seeing that work continue, despite, sadly, the fact that we will be not able to do it in their immediate presence. So in absentia, let us give a huge thanks to both Carter Eckert and William Overholt. And here then, let me now finally turn things over to our amazing Sugata Bose, who has been an extraordinary figure on the Southeast Asia Faculty Working Group, has been instrumental in both envisioning and designing this conference, and we are honored to give him the words in our opening panel. Please join me in welcoming Sugata Bose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and also James, with whom it has been a true privilege to work in order to try and build Southeast Asian studies here at Harvard. This opening panel is dedicated to the memory of one of the greatest interdisciplinary scholars of Southeast Asia, James C. Scott, who passed away last year. I first met Jim Scott in 1991 as he emerged from under a desk in the office of the program in agrarian studies at Yale, where he was trying, unsuccessfully I think, to repair an electrical fixture. That was the very first year of the now celebrated program in agrarian studies, and I was privileged to be one of its first fellows. And I believe I first met Eric Tagliacoso, then a graduate student, at the 10th anniversary observance of that program. Following Jim's lead, we affectionately called our premises the Plantation, even though it had the feel of a commune of the benign variety. Unlike most real plantations, this was a very congenial place, and we toiled happily as intellectual laborers in this lively and stimulating environment, and reflected on a wide array of issues concerning agrarian economy and society. Our reward at the end of the year was a splendid sheep roast at Jim's farm in Durham. Young scholars from remote corners of Asia found in Jim's abode a home away from home, as long as they knew how to cohabit with his beautiful half-domesticated cats. My acquaintance with Jim's scholarship long preceded my face-to-face encounter with him. I read his path-breaking The Moral Economy of the Peasant as I embarked in 1978 on my career as a graduate student in Cambridge. It was the first book I bought with my meager scholarship at Heifers. This book had been published in 1976, the year the most extended peasant war of the 20th century came to a victorious end. Placing the subsistence ethic at the heart of peasant decision-making, Jim offered a different perspective on exploitation that inspired an entire generation of students of agrarian societies in colonial Asia. His study of the Depression-era rebellions in Burma and Vietnam against the British and French colonial states acquired renewed salience as the global credit crisis of 2008 cast its long shadow on rural livelihoods across the world. For his next work, Jim moved the spotlight away from the spectacular rebellions of the sort led by Sayasan of Burma to everyday forms of resistance that included evasion, foot-dragging, and flight. Rarely has a book acquired the status of a classic across so many diverse fields of scholarship as Weapons of the Weak. By the time I finally met Jim, he had just published Domination and the Arts of Resistance. Eavesdropping on the backstage discourse of subordinated groups rather than simply observing their public performances of deference, he revealed the near bankruptcy of theories of hegemony and false consciousness. His inversion of an important aspect of Gramsci's analysis of hegemony was compelling. Contrary to Gramsci's formulation, a reading of hidden transcripts suggested that subordinate classes were less constrained at the level of thought and ideology and more constrained at the level of political action and struggle. Jim's theory of ideological insubordination showed how the infrapolitics of resistance by subordinates against dominant elites and states is very much of a material struggle in which both sides are continually probing for weaknesses and exploiting small advantages. Jim's later books, Seeing Like a State, The Art of Not Being Governed, Two Cheers for Anarchy, and Against the Grain, have then a fascinating intellectual genealogy. In Against the Grain, we witnessed the deft moves of a skilled hunter as he tracked his elusive prey, sedentarization, the ambition of states to settle suspect, wandering peoples and force us all to have fixed addresses. He certainly succeeded in slaying that beast. Giving the Tanner lectures here at Harvard about a decade ago, Jim evoked the image of firing a Parthian shot over the rump of his retreating horse. Yet for this ageless scholar, it was not his last shot, or sedentarization his final prey. We lost him last summer, or did we really? For he exemplified, in the words of his favorite poet, Wisława Szymborska, the joy of writing, the power of preserving, revenge of a mortal hand. When Jim was president of the Association for Asian Studies, he introduced an innovation in the form of border crossing panels. Panels that would cross disciplinary frontiers, area studies boundaries, not to mention borders of colonies and nation states. And we have for you at this James C. Scott panel two of the finest border crossing scholars of Asia. You will first hear from Ronit Ritchie, Professor of Asian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her books include Islam Translated, Literature, Conversion, and the Arabic Cosmopolis of South and Southeast Asia. This book won the Harry Bender Prize. And Banishment and Belonging, Exile and Diaspora in Sarandeep, Lanka, and Ceylon. Eric Tagliacozo, who will speak second, is the John Stambor Professor of History at Cornell University. His books include Secret Trades, Porous Borders, Smuggling and States Along a Southeast Asian Frontier, The Longest Journey, Southeast Asians and the Pilgrimage to Mecca, and most recently, his magnificent In Asian Waters, Oceanic Worlds from Yemen to Yokohama. May I welcome Professor Ronit Ritchie to give her remarks.
Hello everyone, good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the Harvard Asia Center and everyone involved in the organizing of this event for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here. I think I should start with two caveats since I'm on a panel on modern Southeast Asian history in memory of Jim Scott. I'm not trained as a historian. My field is comparative literature, and I'm saying this in order to situate what I'm going to be talking about in a minute. And also, unlike my esteemed co-panelists, unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet Jim Scott in person. I wish I had. So I cannot share with you stories or anecdotes about him, but nonetheless, I'm truly honored to be on this panel that commemorates him and his scholarship. So I'm going to be talking about interlinear translations from the Indonesian Malay world, and which is the topic of my current research. And I'm going to try and connect this topic with the themes, the sort of main themes of this conference, which are thinking about regional dynamics and international linkages in Southeast Asian history. So just a note to begin with. So in this larger region of Southeast Asia, I work primarily on Indonesia and the Malay world, and within that primarily on Indonesia. And this part of the world is one of the world's most linguistically diverse regions. So if we think today in terms of nation states, only Papua New Guinea has more languages than Indonesia. And we can also, another thing we can say about this part of the world is that for a very long time it's been a crossroads of exchange and the arrival and passing of different religions and different cultures, with many types of people traversing it, so diplomats, travelers, traders, soldiers, religious scholars. And if we take these two elements, so on the one hand, the great linguistic diversity and at the same time the multiplicity of people moving through this area, the great mobility that we see in its history, one of the questions that we can ask is what was the role of language, and especially what was the role of translation in this region? And this is a question that I've been thinking about and writing about for quite a while, and it continues to interest me. So Today I'm going to be talking about these interlinear translations, which I'm studying. And I want to connect these texts to the conference theme and to think about them as representing, but also as having the potential to create regional and interregional ties and linkages, especially across the Indian Ocean, and in my case, in particular, with the Middle East and with South Asia. So first of all, what is an interlinear translation? You can see one example, one quite typical example here. An interlinear translation provides the reader with a word-for-word, usually word-for-word rendering of a text, with equivalents, as much as we can have equivalents in translation, appearing in between the lines of the original. So what you see here is a text in Arabic, and I hope you can see that the Arabic is written, even though the script is the same. This is Arabic and Javanese, both written in the Arabic script, but the Arabic is written in larger letters and also darker ink. And these kinds of translations are not in any way unique to Southeast Asia. We know them also from Europe and other parts of the world, and they've been especially important in religious traditions that value text, first of all, written text, and especially sacred text, because when a translation is made of a sacred text, the idea of precision and loyalty to the original is usually very important. Oops, sorry. When I'm thinking about these texts, I'm thinking about them as entry points into studying not just the contact or the connection between the two languages that you can see very easily on the page, that there are two languages, but also thinking about the cultural contacts and the encounters that begin at the level of single words, because we can look at how particular words, especially keywords, important words like important religious or cultural terms, were translated on the page, but also thinking about the broader histories of these texts and these the cultures that are brought together on a manuscript page. So there's religious, cultural, and linguistic and social dynamics happening here. And from the perspective of translation studies, we can think of this type of translation as kind of lying on maybe on the extreme, one extreme of the continuum of translation possibilities, because usually when we think of translation, especially now, we think of something very smooth and something that is actually replacing the original. Whereas here we have always both the original and the translation together. And I think that having them together is something that really sharpens our ability to assess or to see the encounter. And in this talk, I'm sorry because I'm very limited in time, so I'm not really getting into much detail or giving specific examples. I'm trying to present a sort of big picture idea of this, of what these texts can tell us, and what are they telling us about different types of encounters. Here what you see are just a few examples, but my point here is that some of the earliest Islamic manuscripts that we have from Indonesia that have been preserved into the present are interlinear translations. So most of the manuscripts we have, and I'm talking here specifically about, again, about Indonesia, not about all parts of Southeast Asia, and Islamic manuscripts, most of them are from the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. So to have these from the late 16th century, early 17th century is very unusual. And it's interesting to see that some of these manuscripts are interlinear translations, and this might tell us something about the centrality of this practice in bringing the foreign to Muslims in Indonesia, and it also shows us that this practice has been common for a long time. But I do want to make the point that this practice of interlinear translation is not limited to Islamic circles and to contact with Arabic, because if we think about the Islamic materials, we think immediately about contact with Arabic, sometimes also with Persian, and we think about the Middle East and Muslim South Asia. But this has been also important in thinking about linkages with Indian civilization, Hinduism and Buddhism in the history of the Indonesian Malay world. And what you see here is a translation from Old Javanese into modern Javanese of the Ramayana, the great Indian epic. And what we see here is also interesting because, I'm saying, it's Old Javanese to modern Javanese, so we could think of it as the same language, and this is an example of how some languages change so dramatically within several centuries that even native speakers need a translation for their own language. And here we see an example from Bali. These are called Ma'arti texts, where Old Javanese texts, also very often the Indian epics or other Sanskrit-derived texts, are translated from Old Javanese into Balinese. And if we think about regional dynamics with this particular example, it tells us something about the dynamics between the islands of Java and Bali, because much of what was happening in Java in earlier centuries in terms of religion and literary culture then was preserved on the island of Bali. So I've talked a little bit about the translation of words. We can also think about syntax. So when a text is translated word for word into a different language that maybe has a very different grammatical structure, what happens at the sentence level, what happens in terms of idiomatic language, and about the contact between different languages on the page. We can also think, when we look at these manuscripts, about visual dimensions, and how artistic elements and other visual elements of these texts were what they tell us about these contacts and linkages. And so here on the right, you see a Quran manuscript from, also a very early manuscript from the 17th century from Maluku in eastern Indonesia. And we see a very strong European influence in terms of the artwork. And this reminds us that, of course, the contacts and the exchanges were also happening throughout this history with Europe, with different European powers. And another thing that we can think about in terms of the visuality is just looking at these texts, even without the color and the frames, and we can think about, putting aside the content for a minute, we can think about what is happening between the languages, what kind of comparisons, perhaps implicit comparisons, are there on the page when people were writing in one language and then translating into another. Here on the left, you see, I just wanted to show you some nice pictures, so it's a little bit more interesting, but this is a very intriguing manuscript because we see these wayang, wayang is the Javanese shadow puppet theater. We see these wayang-like characters throughout the manuscript, but it's a manuscript of an interlinear translation of an Arabic grammar book. So it's not really clear what these figures are doing there, but again, it's suggestive, and it allows us to think again about artistic elements like color and perspective and different artistic styles, and also themes. So what kind of encounter, or what kind of influence, or what kind of connection is happening here that we have this this integration, you could say, between Arabic grammar and the shadow puppet theater. And I hope it's clear. I mean, I didn't say it, but I hope it's clear. I'm not trying to claim here that Indonesia was just accepting these influences from all over, from the Middle East, from South Asia, from Europe, but rather that the interlinear page is actually a place where we, if we look at it closely and deeply, we can see the ideas and values and structures coming from the outside into Indonesia, but we also see the response, or the adaptation, or the great creativity of the people who received these texts. And finally, the final thing I want to talk about is terminology. As we know, descriptive terms help define and shape what we see. And I've been saying again and again in the last, I don't know how many minutes, I guess my time is almost up, but I've been saying interlinear a lot. And when we use the word interlinear, what we imagine, what comes to mind immediately are lines. And it's a term that prioritizes the lines and the shape of lines on the page. And it's interesting that this is, I'm speaking in English, and interlinear is used in many other languages, Western or European languages, but it's not a term that has been used in Indonesia, in local languages. Nowadays, people often will say terjemahan antar baris, which is a translation of the English word, but we have other terms, and I think it's really important to look at these local terms for the practice in order to see it differently or to see a variety of ways of understanding it. So, for example, we have the term makna gandul. This is a Javanese term where makna comes from the Arabic, and it translates as meaning or significance, and gandul means to hang or to cling to something. And you can see this, you can kind of, if you use your imagination, you can kind of see here in this translation, it's from Arabic to Malay. And the term reflects well, I think, the image of the text tilted Javanese or Malay words hanging onto the straight Arabic line, as well as more metaphorically, the meaning, so the Malay or Javanese meaning hanging onto the Arabic one or dependent on it. So it's a visual and tactile metaphor of proximity and touch as the lines cling and connect. And the Javanese and Malay leans on the Arabic original for its explication and significance. So this is one term, one local term. Another one is sahi, and this has in the center the word sah, which is an Arabic word that means valid or true or legitimate. And this term relates to the tradition of study with a teacher and writing down the teacher's words of wisdom as the lessons progressed. So traditionally, and also even nowadays in Islamic boarding schools, the teacher reads the sentence word for word in Arabic and translates, goes back and forth between the two languages, and the student writes down the translation. So here I think the metaphor is one hinting at the central relationship of any seeker of religious knowledge, because the entry into the world of Arabic and more broadly Islamic knowledge always required an experienced, pious, and learned teacher to guide the way. So what we see here is that these connections and dependency and proximity that we find on the page are not only between languages, scripts, or teachings, but also between the teacher and the disciple. And this also relates back, if we're thinking about linkages, to pre-Islamic times. Many people have written about how the Islamic boarding schools have probably emerged from earlier forms of teaching that are more Indian-like, of a guru and several disciples. The disciples gaining instruction from their teacher in the mountain hermitages of Java. And this is finally, this is my last slide. These interlinear translations have also been referred to as kitab jenggotan, and jenggot is a beard. So this means basically bearded books. And the beard refers to the Malay or Javanese translation that starts between the line but then spreads and extends beyond the lines to the page's margins. And that can be one interpretation of the beard, and another one can be just the individual beards, a beard for each word. And the image of the beard offers us a visual metaphor and also a tactile one that can imply softness, smoothness, prickliness, or roughness. And it invites us to imagine the stroking of the text while deep in thought, moving the fingers across it as it was studied with a guru and recited repeatedly. In the educational context in which most of these religiously oriented manuscripts were written and copied and also read, the beard could also hint at the image of an old, knowledgeable, and pious religious scholar. And in the Malay-speaking Malay and Javanese and Indonesian regions, it could also suggest the figure of a foreign teacher of Islam, and in this case, most likely an Arab. And what you see here in these images, which are from different manuscripts, are not interlinear, but I wanted to show you that such teachers were depicted sometimes in manuscripts, and we can see very clearly that they look different. So if you look at their facial features, if you look at their dress, at their turban, and of course they're bearded. While their disciples are portrayed as, again, as these wayang figures. So the local disciples are portrayed as wayang figures, whereas the teacher, the pious, knowledgeable, wise teacher, bearded teacher, is a foreigner. And this, speaking about beards, also I can't get into it, but this also invites us to think about the issue of gender. And so these books conjure not just a comparison or relationship between languages, but kind of like with the other term, ngesahi, also between bearded and unbearded, foreigner and local. And this comparison or consideration extends and expands from language and script also towards social interactions and categories on and also beyond the manuscript page. So I hope I've been able to show you, however briefly, some of the ways in which these interlinear translations offer us windows onto regional dynamics and broader contexts, with especially, again, in my case, the Middle East and South Asia, in the history of modern Southeast Asia. Moving from the translation and interpretation of single words, among them key religious and cultural terms, to the movement of texts and entire intellectual and literary traditions, via this translation paradigm, to visual dimensions that hint at contact and exchange, to social, gender, and educational dynamics. All of these, this is what I want to suggest, all of these are present on the interlinear page if only we look at it closely. Thank you.
What a lovely presentation, Rohit. On bearded books, we'll discuss these further. But first, Eric. Yeah.
So thank you so much to Shugata for that really nice introduction, and thank you so much to Michael and James also for inviting all of us. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but I was really glad to be invited and to be on a panel with my very old and very close friend Ronit. It's just lovely to be here, and I was not able to come the last time that James invited me, so I felt even happier to come this time. I was supposed to be in California lecturing at something else this weekend, and when Shugata invited me to this, and I told him that, and he was very understanding and very polite and kind, as is his wont, but then dangled the Jim Scott panel idea to me, and I just thought, oh, I can't miss this because Jim was my teacher. So as always, he knew exactly the right things to say. So I feel really glad that this is being done and that Jim is being honored in this way. And as Shugata said, we met when I was a graduate student and he was visiting faculty to Yale. So it's been a kind of long friendship from that. I did want to say just one thing, that when I was a graduate student, a fellow graduate student and I was trying to learn how to be a Southeast Asian historian. My friend was trying to learn how to be an anthropologist of East Africa. We had the notion together that we would approach Jim to do a class, just the two of us with Jim, about the Indian Ocean. And we thought, he'll never say yes, he's too busy, he's too famous, he's too in demand. But of course, Jim being Jim did say yes. And somehow I feel him smiling at the idea of this panel and this recognition. I wanted to just say a few things about the ocean in my presentation, although we didn't discuss this, Ronit and I. It kind of jibes nicely with the things that she's been saying about literature in the Indian Ocean. I'm going to talk a little bit more about history. When we think about histories of the Indian Ocean, to me, a lot of it comes back to the kind of Pater Nostrum figure of this, and that's K.N. Chowdhury's and his amazing trade and civilization in the Indian Ocean, which kind of set an agenda for Indian Ocean studies that has been something that people for decades have been following in this wake. And I include Shugata's own recent extraordinary book, 100 Horizons, as part of that intellectual genealogy. One of the things that becomes clear if you're thinking about this kind of world as a world, an oceanic world, is that there are a lot of people kind of thinking in these ways in the last few decades about how to carve up space differently in histories of various parts of the planet. So we get the Black Atlantic and that entire paradigm. There's a lot of work going on in the Pacific now in different ways of thinking about recategorizing the Pacific as a place of study that anyone from Chile to Vladivostok can talk about together. And indeed, at Cornell, a colleague of mine and close friend who teaches Latin American history, he and I have done a class together called The Pacific Horizon, which really just kind of mixed people in different and new ways that I thought was really productive. Of course, this is not just a modern enterprise either. If we go back historically, people like Adam Smith, who you see up here on the screen, started to think in the 18th century about the kind of changes that were happening between a kind of laissez-faire trading system that was developing in the world and moving towards mercantilism, and that by the 19th century, when we think of still other classical thinkers like Karl Marx, who is, I love it that he's doing that in this picture, saw in this much more kind of coercive processes taking place that was not just about the Indian Ocean as a site of laissez-faire trade or mercantilism, but that these much more coercive processes trying to co-opt the means of production were starting to take place in his lifetime, and that he started to call out in very interesting ways. So maybe what we can do is, just because we only have a few minutes, is to just try to show how some of these circuits were formed in the Indian Ocean from, as I say in the title of the talk, from the Bosphorus to Bombay and from Bombay to Borneo. And really what I'm trying to argue in this very short speech is that these, far from being isolated nodes or even theaters during a time of the carving up of the world in the last several centuries, these harbors around the Indian Ocean, including very much Southeast Asia, were becoming utterly interconnected and dependent in a variety of ways. So maybe where we could start first is just in the Middle East with the idea of the Middle East, and we can argue that some of these colonial circuits of the Indian Ocean writ large began right at the entrance of the continent itself, in Constantinople, or what we now call Istanbul, the bridge between Asia and Europe. In the late 19th century, as had been the case previously for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, control of this city and this particular waterway, the Bosphorus, was seen as imperative for political considerations. If we can look at this through a number of different windows, the one that I think is most salient for our purposes today in linking Southeast Asia to this wider geography of the Indian Ocean and South Asia and West Asia would be one of thinking about how political control changed at this time. And I like this map because it shows the range of actors that were really getting involved in the Middle East from the European vantage. And you can see the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, both England and France involved in Egypt, the French, the British, the Dutch, all having important consulates in Jeddah to try to manage the pilgrim trade of the pilgrimage to Mecca, and even Italians involved. I never thought as a Southeast Asianist that I would ever get to use Italian, a language from my family, but the Italians were involved, of course, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, and they left copious records about Southeast Asian pilgrims moving across the Indian Ocean. And to my knowledge, none of this stuff has been read in the archives in Rome before by any Southeast Asianist. It's just a happenstance that I got interested in this. So we do and can find new sources about this in kind of interesting places. Now, when we're thinking about what was actually moving, of course, there were a lot of different products that were involved in the Indian Ocean trade. I'm going to focus on just a couple of them right now that interest me, are one of the commodities that linked the Middle East and Southeast Asia across this wide expanse of ocean. Pearls, some of the world's best pearls come from the Persian Gulf, but also from island Southeast Asia. And this became something known to these trading networks and to eventually imperial powers. Think about Mikimoto, the Japanese company that really started harvesting its pearls in Southeast Asia before it became much more focused on this in Northeast Asia. But different bodies of water take on different valences in this respect. So the Persian Gulf might be important in that way, but really the Red Sea is the body of water in the Middle East that is most important, I would argue, to this expanded definition of Southeast Asia looking west towards these other landscapes. This has been true for a very, very long time, but it's particularly true, as we all know, in 1869 when the Suez Canal is opened. I love this very moody image of ships, sail ships moving through the Suez Canal, and kind of this idea of this orderly procession of ships moving from the Mediterranean basin into the Indian Ocean basin as Europe and Southeast Asia start to become much closer, the subject of another one of Shugata's most recent books. But it wasn't just things like pearls that are moving across these networks, it's also disease. And I know we have a number of health professionals with us who are going to be presenting today as well. One of the things that's deeply interested me about the connections between Southeast Asia and the Middle East has been the movement of pilgrims. But among these pilgrims, also, of course, disease was traveling in huge quantities across the Indian Ocean. This is from a French journal in the late 19th century, Le Petit Journal, which sees the angel of death and his scythe moving through people as a kind of metaphor for cholera, moving through these diasporic and moving populations of the poor. But this is particularly important in the kinds of Hajj networks that were moving across the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia to the Middle East. Again, if we look at Italian documentation from this period, this is an article, Il Hijaz, Il Pellegrinaggio e il Cholera, which talks literally about Italian records from the Horn of Africa being extremely concerned about Southeast Asian pilgrims coming through the Red Sea up from Aden to Jeddah and then disembarking in Mecca and Medina, and how this brought cholera, seen up here on the screen, across these huge oceanic distances on an enormous scale. So this is something maybe we can hear more about later today from our colleagues in medicine too, how Southeast Asia has been connected to the Middle East and other parts of the Indian Ocean through these vectors as well. I promised another commodity aside from pearls, and so I'll just talk a moment here about coffee, because some of you probably had to caffeinate up in order to be able to listen to Talia Kotso early in the morning on a Friday at the end of the week. But again, if we follow not just pearls, but other items and commodities like coffee, we can see how the Indian Ocean is actually linked across enormous quantities of space. We actually have the dates of when coffee left Ethiopia, went to Yemen, and eventually started to move in both directions around the Indian Ocean. We have actually a very good idea of when this happened, port to port to port, when coffee moves across these spaces. So if you went to Starbucks this morning to get through my lecture to have a cup of mocha java, and that's what you said to your person at the register, just think about those terms. Mocha is the port in Yemen that most of the coffee came out of. Java is a place that coffee came to, but it had no connection with coffee until the Dutch realized that coffee grew really well in Javanese soil. So that seems important as well. I'm going to just switch to South Asia here for a little bit and try to kind of argue that, that South Asia is part of this equation as well. Of course, the British are the power that is most involved in South Asia, but there were other powers that also had a presence there that tried to use South Asia as a base for dealing with Indian Ocean trade. These were not just European powers, they were also diasporas of other people. We can think here about the fabulous work of Eng Sang Ho, your former colleague at Harvard, who's looked at the Hadrami networks coming out from the Hadramaut in Yemen and how these Hadrami populations moved down the coast of East Africa, to, eventually all the way to South Africa, very much to India, and of course to Southeast Asia as well, where there are Hadramis scattered around island Southeast Asia. And that's been really important in rethinking some of these paradigms as well. I would also argue for the importance of the labor paradigm in this. I took this photograph 25 years ago on the docks in Cochin in South India of this gentleman who was a stevedore That is, he was working, lifting things on and off the docks on the Malabar coast of South Asia. And I think he's emblematic to me of this kind of laboring poor populations around the Indian Ocean that connected this world as well. I've always wondered what happened to this man. If you look at his body, he's got this kind of Adonis body of a young man who's just spent every day of his life lifting heavy sacks of things, and yet his face is a middle-aged man's face. So there's something about the labor component of this that is really important as well. So if we go through the Malabar coasts and think about this and the spices that were coming out of this place into these networks that fueled these networks of exchange across the Indian Ocean, that seems very important to me as well. And as I said, it's not just the British who are involved in this in South Asia. The Danes were involved in this and had actually settlements on the coasts of India. The Dutch were involved, as were the French. I want to just show you an image from Tavernier of the Sultan of Bijapur's Hajj ship sailing across the Indian Ocean from South Asia to the Middle East. So again, it's not just the full radial across the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, but there were alternative routes too that hugged the top of the Indian Ocean. And just to prioritize one last European power in South Asia and how they are important in helping to make these levels of exchange alongside Hadramis, alongside laborers, we can think about cinnamon coming out of Sri Lanka. Really, the Dutch, the only real lasting impact the Dutch had, I would argue, on the coasts of South Asia really was the Sri Lankan case and how much cinnamon starts to come out into the world. So that's another way of thinking about this. I'm going to use my last few minutes to just ground us more firmly in Southeast Asia, where these processes were happening as well. As many of you know, the Dutch were the preeminent power, as Ronit was speaking about too, in what we now think of Indonesia, what was the Dutch East Indies at that point. And this was really a brutal campaign of the Dutch taking over Indonesia, a very small country taking over a very large country. This is an image of soldiers in Aceh, the so-called veranda of Mecca in northern Sumatra, where the Dutch tried to show their European counterparts that they were not a kind of has-been European power of the 17th century, but still mattered in the 19th century. And these were really brutal campaigns of subduing the last large Muslim sultanate of any size left in Southeast Asia at this time. It was also not just a military enterprise, but an intellectual enterprise of people like this, Snouko Goronyi, the great Orientalist from the Netherlands, who spent a lot of time in the Middle East, who knew Arabic very well, and who also used his knowledge to help the Dutch campaigns in Aceh. Something very much on my mind now with the change of administrations in Washington and the kinds of things we need to be mindful of as scholars in where our knowledge ends up. Just to end, I think some of the things that are also important about thinking about this as a unitary world of the Indian Ocean, not just Southeast Asia as in and of itself, but with a wider horizon, to borrow Shugata's term, to think of the larger parts of the Indian Ocean. Port culture, if you go to places like this, the port of Penang, you will see much of the same architecture in place in these ports across the Indian Ocean. And I was really reminded of that in the time I spent in Aden, in Mombasa, in other parts of South Asia, and then coming down into Southeast Asia, that these ports are linked to each other. And often they have much more in common with each other across the latitudes of the Indian Ocean than they have with their own hinterlands, whether in Southeast Asia, South Asia, or in West Asia. Language also connects these places. So you've got the full and much better story from Ronit than what I can give you. But of course, the use of Arabic, in her term, the Arabic cosmopolis that connects across the Indian Ocean as well, and that I think is deeply important, even going and stretching to places like Singapore, where again, you see the echoes of this architecture across a lot of different space. I'm trying to move quickly in just speaking about this, and I'll explain more in just a second at the very end of this talk. But maybe the last stop we can have vis-a-vis the title from the Bosphorus to Bombay to Borneo is to Borneo. And we don't often put these three places in conversation with each other. The Bosphorus, Bombay, Borneo. It has a nice alliteration, but what else binds them together? And what I'm arguing in this short talk is that they are bound together. You can see this through disease vectors. You can see this through the movement of products. You can see this through the movement of labor. And you can see this through the movement of language, as Ronit suggested. So maybe I'll just end with a couple of quick asides to other scholarship that I think is really important in thinking about this. And I'm going to just introduce a couple of close comrades. Sima Alavi also thinking about this vis-a-vis Islam in very sophisticated ways. Here again, a kind of Muslim cosmopolitanism that she suggests is part of these discussions. And Harvard's former scholar, Sunil Amrith, who has done this through a much more environmental lens, the ways that these different land and seascapes are connected through large amounts of space. I'm going to give you just two last images. One that I've been thinking about because I was lecturing about this back at Cornell earlier this week. Even Gandhi, who we think about as primordially South Asian, primordially Indian, is part of these Indian Ocean worlds. First of all, because he started as a barrister, right, in South Africa. So he was part of the South African tradition of history in these things as well, not just in India. And when we think about nonviolent resistance, again, something on my mind these days, maybe on your minds too, this was not actually the beginnings of nonviolent resistance. We have to go to the other side of the Indian Ocean to see this among the Saman movement in Java, which actually introduced the idea of nonviolent resistance to the Dutch a couple of decades before this became much more widely known through Gandhi. So just to end with language, one of the things that Ronit touched upon is the importance of language. What the Samanists did, these farmers on the north coast of Java, in dealing with the Dutch, who were being told that they had to pay these extortionate taxes to the Dutch Empire, is that they spoke to the Dutch not in High Javanese, which is what they were expected to speak to their superiors, not in Middle Javanese, but they deliberately spoke to the Dutch in Low Javanese, a method of resistance, probably the only resistance left to them when confronted with the superior guns and organization of the Dutch. So that is a way of thinking of the Indian Ocean world together. Southeast Asia, in this vision, plays a part of this Indian Ocean, but it's an important part and it's a connected part. And I'll just say as my last words for this talk, so I keep to 20 minutes, when Shugata told me we had 20 minutes to speak, I was thinking, holy shit, how am I going to do that? There's so much to say. I could have gone on for another 20 minutes, not looking west to east across the Indian Ocean and how Southeast Asia fits into that regime. But I could have gone on for another 20 minutes how Southeast Asia looks north to south with a similar oceanic description of the connections between China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. So what do these two visions have in common? Well, Southeast Asia is the hinge of these Asian seas. Southeast Asia is the middle, the center, not the side. Because the Association of Asian Studies meeting is about to just come up, I think in 2 weeks or a week. I'm not going to be there this year. It's in Columbus, Ohio. We have enough cold and snow in Ithaca for me to travel to Ohio in March. But if you travel, if you go to these kinds of meetings as a Southeast Asianist, you always recognize that you're in a much smaller and seemingly a less important community than the South Asianists and the East Asianists who are at these meetings. What I want to suggest by this presentation is actually Southeast Asia can be seen as the center of all of this, not in the margins. And just to end with Jim, since this is a panel for Jim, Jim was one of the people who best taught us this, that Southeast Asia can be seen as the center through all of the incredible work he did, placing it at the center of his oeuvre of knowledge. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Eric and Ronit, for setting us on our way in a splendid fashion for our day-long conversations. I want to bring the audience into the discussion as quickly as possible. But, let me start by, picking up on, I think, two very important points that were made by Ronit in the course of her presentation. One is that we need to see even these texts which feature interlinear translation as original works. Eric mentioned K.N. Chowdhury and his book, Trade and Civilization in the Indian Ocean. In that book, and also in Asia before Europe, he wanted to banish the term colonization from colonization of Southeast Asia, that is by China and India, from the vocabulary of Indian Ocean history. But at the same time, he introduced another term, interweaving, because we need to be able to understand the nature of these encounters, and that's why it's important to recognize that even if we are talking about an Arabic cosmopolis, it's not a one-way flow of ideas and culture. It's being creatively adapted, assimilated, and turned into original works. And one person who, in the early 20th century, recognized this creativity of Southeast Asians in the literary sphere was none other than Rabindranath Tagore, when he went on his voyage to Southeast Asia and wrote his letters, Javajatrir Potro, letters from a traveler to Java. He believed that the Southeast Asian versions of the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, that he found in Southeast Asia were as original, if not more, than the many versions that circulated in India. The second point that I found fascinating, and I hope that Annette will come into the discussion, is that we know that there have been so many early modern texts which have combined textual description and analysis with sensory perception. For someone from South Asia, what comes to mind immediately are the great illuminated manuscripts of the Mughal era. But you were saying something more. There were, of course, these beautiful images that you showed us, adorning the pages of your interlinear translation. But you also spoke about the shape of the lines, that the lines themselves had a certain visual character. And I'd like you to say a little bit more, about that particular insight that you gave. And as for Eric, one reason that I almost arm-twisted him to come is that, he is one of the scholars of the Indian Ocean who has creatively trespassed across the temporal threshold of 1800. We have had very great historians of the Indian Ocean in the late 20th century who all tended to stop at 1750 or 1800. Even Chowdhury was looking at the millennium that stretched from the rise of Islam to about 1750 or perhaps 1800. And there had been a presumption that with the onset of European imperial domination, the old organic unity of the Indian Ocean was just ripped apart. Now, we have to recognize that something dramatic did happen with European colonial conquest, but many of these links and connections were in fact reordered, not fully ruptured. And there are so many ways through the circulation of commodities, through the movement of disease, that we can study how this continued to be a connected zone across that great temporal divide of 1800. And I'm glad, Eric, that you brought in even the brutal aspects of colonial conquest. I've just been teaching a class on modern Southeast Asia, and we studied the Aceh War. And how did that begin? I mean, in 1871, there was an Anglo-Dutch treaty, and which you've shown in your book, Secret Trade's Porous Borders, how the border between the British and the Dutch empires came to be more rigidly drawn in that 50-year period from 1865 to 1915. And the two imperial powers came to a shared understanding of sovereignty and borders to an extent. But of course, what happened was from 1873, the Dutch got embroiled in the Aceh War, and the British in the Ashanti War, because they had traded the Gold Coast and Sumatra. And I think what we also need to recognize in this conference, as we talk about Southeast Asia, is the role of scholars and universities. And Gronier is a very fascinating example, who was advising the Dutch colonial state in the 1890s and the early 20th century on how to finally put down what turned out to be a 4-decade-long resistance by the people of Aceh. It lasted from 1873 all the way to 1912. And I was teaching the Dutch colonial conquest of the outer islands of the East Indies alongside the U.S. colonial conquest of the Philippines. And there again, there are crucial Harvard figures who were deeply involved in that history, including two, Leonard Wood, who happened to be a Harvard Medical School alumnus, and Cameron Forbes, who both served as Governor Generals of the Philippines, both in the phase of actually subduing the southern part of the Philippines, Mindanao, and so on, but also going together in 1921 as part of the Wood-Forbes Commission to report that the Philippines was yet unfit for self-government. I think, when we first thought about this, conference, we were simply going to call it Southeast Asia's connections with South Asia and the Middle East. And you've actually proved that it's an enterprise that has been worth it, even though the title changed. But let me, these are some brief comments, and you might want to respond, but perhaps we'll get a couple of questions and comments to get the audience involved, and then get your response. And there are two microphones at the end of the two aisles. And since we are recording and live streaming, it would be helpful if you could come to the microphones.
Thank you so much for both of these extraordinary presentations and for the response. I have many questions, principally for Ronit, but the first is in part connected to and inspired by some of Eric's observations about commercial exchanges and forms of currency across the Indian Ocean region. My question, Ronit, for you was to ask whether within the materials that you're exploring for this new project, if you've encountered prefaces that amount to virtual theorizations of the nature of interlinear translation or translation itself, and whether you have seen evidence of a kind of implied stratification between languages or normative judgments about the value of Arabic as a kind of currency over other local languages. And one of the reasons I'm moved to ask this question is that in my own research in the materials that I've looked at in Egypt and West Africa, I've seen really striking, uncanny parallels as authors have thought about Arabic as a kind of unalloyed gold currency relative to other languages that have been compared to tinsel or alloyed copper. So that's the first question. I have others, but I don't know if you want to respond to that first.
Please do.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, to you for these comments and questions. And it's a great question, and I wish I had, I had a more. I wish the materials were more explicit about this question, which I'm also very eager to know more about. So what were these translators actually thinking when they took a text in Arabic and decided to translate it in this particular way? I haven't come across any prefaces, and I've looked at quite a few manuscripts that theorize or explain what the translators were thinking about the act of translation, why they chose these particular texts. I mean, in some cases, of course, we can assume why they chose them. They were very central texts, either in the grammatical tradition or theological or legal traditions of Arabic. But I haven't come across a single preface that explains or that discusses, the reasons or the thoughts about the translation act or the relationship between the languages. However, in trying myself to sort of engage with that question, even though it's very challenging because I think, I'm trained in a particular way. I'm trying to look at these manuscripts in terms of their visual appearance, because I think the visuality is a key to understanding how people thought about the relationship between Arabic and local languages. So I don't have a background in art history, so sometimes I feel like a little bit of an imposter, but I'm trying to think about this question. And one thing that we see very clearly, and I think you could see it in the examples, is that usually there seems to be, we could say, a dominance of Arabic. The Arabic is written in a larger script, darker script. The writing is often finer. When there is color added, it's often added only in the Arabic and not in the translation. So we have all of these ways of saying, Arabic is more important, Arabic is dominant. And I think that is true to a certain extent. It's definitely the case. But I think once you look more closely and you look at a variety of examples, then we see the more complicated picture, where sometimes there's more of a question about this. There's more of maybe of a coming together of the languages within particular ways of framing them. And there are even ways in which sometimes the local language, in my opinion, becomes more important. So just one example, and it's an unusual example, but we have a few manuscripts where both the Arabic and the translation are written in the Javanese script. So that's an example of how, in fact, the Arabic itself is written in a non-Arabic script, and it's written in the wrong direction. Because instead of being written from right to left, it's written from left to right, so it's sort of following in the footsteps of Javanese. So that's one example that comes to mind where, that sort of flips the hierarchy. But thank you very much. I have a lot more to say about this stuff.
If I could ask another
Sure.
fellow follow-up. Thank you. I'd be curious to hear more your observations about, given what you just said, about what materials you're looking at tell us about Arabographic developments, the development of script forms, and the way in which vernacular languages or local languages like Javanese were coming to be conveyed in Arabic, but also with new letters given that are not original to Arabic to convey local vocalizations, and but also in connection to your attention to these beautiful illuminations and the interplay between visual and linguistic aspects of the manuscripts you're looking at. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about patterns of patronage. Who are these interlinear translations seeming to serve? And perhaps also in connection to some of the final comments that you made in your presentation, what does this tell us about the class contexts and gendered contexts in which these translations were conceived, were commissioned, perhaps curated, archived? Who exactly were they serving? And if you are working also with not just Quranic translation, but hadith, or other charismatic religious texts, where chains of transmission and claims to interpretive authority, asnad, appear, are there patterns that you're seeing in connection to transregional claims of learning between the Malay world and elsewhere in the Middle East, for example? What claims of tutelage, for example, are you seeing emerging in the materials that you're working with on interlinear translations, especially in the earlier period that you're studying? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope I remember even some of that. So in terms of the script, your questions about the different types of script and the development of scripts and sound, this is something that I haven't yet gone into much. But we do have, of course, when Javanese or Malay or other Indonesian languages are written in the Arabic script, there are additions because some of the sounds don't exist, either don't exist in Arabic or don't exist in the local language, and so they make adaptations. And I think one of the very interesting things that, again, I haven't gotten to yet, but I'd like to think about, and this is again within the framework of translation in the senses, because I talked about visuality, but the sense of sound and oral, AURAL, is also very important in this tradition, in this practice, because immediately when we know that we have two languages on the page, we also have two sets of sounds, which are very, very different, or can be very different between Arabic and, for example, Javanese. So not only how are these letters written, but how have they been pronounced in the two languages, and how this shifts over time, because this is, outside of the context of interlinear translation, but I remember that when I first went to Indonesia, let's say in the 90s, people weren't making that much of an effort to pronounce Arabic words that derived from Arabic with an Arabic accent. They were just saying them with an Indonesian accent, and that was completely acceptable. And then gradually, over the last several decades, it seems that pronouncing Arabic words with an authentic Arabic accent has become more important, and it sort of proves one's piety or one's level of being religious. So that's just an example from now, but I think also historically it would be very interesting to know more about the pronunciation and the two sets of sounds that exist on this page. Can you remind me?
Yeah.
Where did the manuscripts come from?
Well, the patronage
Yeah.
contexts and
Just
patterns of
very,
patronage.
very briefly, because I want to leave time for Eric's talk as well. Most of the manuscripts that we have nowadays have been, I would say, and I shouldn't generalize because really there's so many of these manuscripts, and I don't, haven't really been able to even survey, all of them or even most of them. But many of them, let's say, come from libraries in pesantren, which are the Islamic boarding schools, where these types of translation are still used. So if you go to a pesantren now in Java, you will see kids or teenagers, or young students sitting and reciting these texts where the teacher will say a sentence, but not the entire sentence, word for word or 2-3 words together in Arabic, and then translate to the Javanese. And there's a very particular way of doing it. It's not random. There are grammatical codes. There are words that tell the student that this word is the subject of the Arabic sentence, and this word is the predicate, interlaced within the way the teacher speaks. So many of the manuscripts come from these collections, and I would say that the main bodies of knowledge that they encompass are theology, jurisprudence, and grammar, and Sufism. Those are probably the largest categories that we have. Thank you.
Anyone else? I would particularly encourage any students in this audience to, yes,
Not a
please.
student, so I apologize for that.
No, that's all right. But I have seen a hand up from a student as well who can
Would
follow.
someone like to come first? I'd be happy to.
No,
yield to a
please
student.
go ahead. Go ahead. You're at the microphone, so let's
Okay.
have your question or comment.
Great. So I had a question. It's a great first panel. Appreciated it. Question mostly for Eric, or kind of a reaction, which may be a question. So I like the idea of opening the conference with this flex, if you will, about Southeast Asia's centrality. But there's a way in which the image I sort of have of the way you think about centrality is one very much of flows. Okay, so this idea and commodities and ships and ports, and one could almost think of it in terms of like an image like a pinball. You know, pinballs kind of bouncing through Southeast Asia as they go on to other places. And I wonder if we might think about centrality in an additional way, a complementary way, and maybe a way to build upon that notion, and maybe a more less maritime, maybe more continental, more fixed, more demographic kind of way, less about flows and more about things that changed permanently through these flows. So when I think about Southeast Asia and teach about Southeast Asia, a point I often make is, other than Java and basically the Tonkin Delta, I mean, Southeast Asia is just this zone of very low population densities. And it's surrounded by China and what we today would call China and India, which are sort of the most densely populated, the two real demographic behemoths in the world. And so what happened historically was these massive demographic giants sort of flowed into this vessel, in a sense, of Southeast Asia, and largely then led to these larger populations. And that was once upon a time a flow. But now you have populations that are just as fixed and just as much a part of nation states, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, who came from these other places. And I wonder if there's even a way. So one point would be to say the centrality has something more solid as well as fluid to it, and whether we think about that metaphorically, if that makes sense. But also to maybe think about whether there might be a dark underside to thinking about these things too exclusively in terms of flows, which is this idea. I think there's a way in which ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia are seen as forever not permanent, not indigenous, because of these earlier flows. And if, in some ways, thinking about a kind of more fixed, more demographic, more continental kind of centrality to Southeast Asia, in addition to this kind of flowing, fluid, commodity-driven, trade-driven centrality, might give us a different perspective on the region and its centrality. So, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Dan. And I think there is a good way of kind of seeing those as complementary visions. And the two sets of books that I would kind of throw out as being very useful in that are the kind of two of the three classic authors, I think, on early modern Southeast Asia. So those three authors for me would be Tony Reed, Victor Lieberman, who's Dan's colleague at University of Michigan, and Barbara Watson-Andaya at Hawaii. So when I teach the modern Southeast Asian history class at Cornell, there's about a third of them are graduate students and about 2/3 are undergraduates. And the undergraduates get a taste of this, right, because they're just taking Southeast Asian history to start learning about it. But the grad students have to get a heavier dose of Dr. Tagliacozzo's what's good for you medicine for learning about early modern Southeast Asia. And so they get Barbara Watson-Andaya's Flaming Womb to kind of really importantly get gender into this discussion. But it's the first two books that I would use as try to use as an answer for what Dan is asking, because the first of these authors, Tony Reed, who wrote this incredible 2-volume study in 1988 and 1993 about Southeast Asia and the Age of Commerce, argues exactly that. It's this incredible world of flows, and part of the big story there is exactly the population story that Dan is saying. So we know China or what we now call China and what we now call India are these population behemoths. So in the age of commerce that he's talking about, it's roughly about 300 million people in each of those two polities, and Southeast Asia has roughly about a tenth together, about 30 million people compared to these two places. And he argues for a difference in looking at the approaches of these places based on this incredibly different population profile, right? And the main thing is that wars in South Asia and East Asia are over land because there's not enough land. There's too many people. Wars in Southeast Asia are not over land, they're over people. So if you conquer your neighbor, you have no interest in taking their land. What you want is to take their people to become part of your retinue. So I think that's the kind of the first vision. The second vision, which we now I think officially can call the Michigan vision after your question and after Victor Lieberman's two incredible books, which were a kind of counterpoint, a very friendly counterpoint to Tony Reid's first two books. And this is his Strange Parallels, 2 volumes, which came out in the noughts, which is a Eurasian story. It's a comparative history looking at Southeast Asia in a landed way, in the way you're talking about. And he argues exactly what you're saying, is that this can be seen in different ways, in a much more landed way. And I think what's instructive to me, watching these kind of two colossal intellects think about Southeast Asia in these wider geographic forms, is that both can work at the same time. It's not either or. And for me, the place that the two visions meet is in the coasts of Southeast Asia, and that's why I'm so interested in this. I remember being an assistant professor and going to a small conference in Southern California that had this incredible windows over the ocean in Southern California. There was about 15 or 20 people at the conference, and Tony Reid and Victor Lieberman came in from opposite doors, and I felt this collective holding of breath as these two men kind of met each other, as these two books had, each set of 2 books had come out, and everybody thought, oh my God, what's going to happen? I certainly thought that as a young professor. And they were just totally gentlemanly and shook hands and talked. And that's the way it should be. You know, we can have different visions of this and then find where is the common ground. The common ground seems to me to be the coasts. So if you're on the Vietnamese coast, the Burmese coast, the Thai coasts, you have a lot in common with this world of island Southeast Asia. We traditionally divide them up as island and mainland Southeast Asia, but there really is a common ground meeting in these places. So Hoi An in Vietnam has more in common, I would say, with this island world of Southeast Asia, an incredible exchange and just things moving, people moving, ideas moving, scripts and languages moving, than it does with the interior in a place like Hanoi, right? So that's what I would try to answer as a way of bridging the gap between those two things.
But you know, this kind of a demographic typology of densely populated and sparsely populated regions can also be taken as a starting point for studying, you know, modern, connections across the Indian Ocean. And, you know, it probably is not very helpful to think about the whole of India or the whole of China as these, spaces with huge populations. Okay, if you look at Southeast Asia, and this is something that was started by Chris Baker in a Comparative Studies in Society and History article, you look at 1850, and there are densely populated places, Java, for example, and the Red River Delta of northern Vietnam, as you mentioned. And then there are sparsely populated bits. But that easy demographic typology is disturbed from the mid-19th century onwards because you have flows of people, capitalists, laborers, coming from the densely populated agrarian zones of India, let's say Tamil Nadu or southern China. And the European capital is mostly interested in the mines and plantations. And migrant labor is coming in from China and India. These are becoming the new concentrations of population. And they have to be provisioned, they have to be fed. And so what happens? You open up the great rice frontiers of the deltas of the Irrawaddy and the Chao Phraya and the Mekong. And of course, there are people moving from North to South Vietnam, from Java to the outer islands, but also, from India and China into, many different parts of Southeast Asia. So the demographic typology with which you begin gets to be completely altered, yet new sets of connections are forged. So it's possible to look at Southeast Asian connections in the modern period as well, from that premise.
If I could just add on just a tiny add-on to this, and I was thinking of Michael when Shugata was just speaking. Michael and I met at a conference at Penn State, a Sino-Southeast Asia conference, and I'm not going to name the scholar, but there was a scholar who was being provocative and who's a well-known scholar of Vietnamese history, and he suggested to this pretty august body of people, of scholars, do you remember this, Michael? That Vietnam might be actually seen as just a kind of a vessel of Chinese migration, and that Vietnameseness wasn't a very useful concept at all. Maybe it was just all Nam Yue people who came from southern China and then started speaking slightly different languages. And I remember looking at Michael, who I had just met, and thought there was this dead silence in the room. So again, these flows of people and the kind of the peopling of the deltas, as Shugata is saying, really matters. It alters. Burma, before 1800, 75% of the demography of Burma was in Upper Burma. And it completely changes in the 19th century, a lot of it with Indian immigration, but also with Burmese moving down to the delta, and it completely switches, and it becomes 75% of Burma's population is in and around the delta by the end of the 19th century. So I think that's right.
Sudarshana.
Thank you so much for these wonderful talks. It's always inspiring to hear about international linkages for those of us who do transregional history. But I was wondering if Professor Taliakozo could speak a little bit about disconnections and ruptures, especially as we're thinking about what keeps us in academia from perhaps seeing these linkages sometimes. So what are some things that have been obscuring these connections? If you could tell us a little bit about that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, I'll just try to answer quickly because I don't know how we're doing on time, but I mean, I think probably the quickest answer would be the nation, right? So, when I gave my job talk at Cornell, I thought it was basically my first job talk. I didn't have much idea how any of this worked, but I just thought these people are never going to take me because this is the house that George Cahan and Benedict Anderson built. It's all about nationalism. My work has no nationalism in it. I don't care about nationalism. It's all international, trans-regional, transoceanic. They'll never take me. What's the point of this? I'm just wasting their time. But again, speaking of generosity of spirit, because this is a Jim Scott panel, Benedict Anderson, who sat next to me and creeped me out, the fact that he was sitting next to me when I was giving my talk, because I thought this is, the guy on nationalism is right next to me. It just shows this kind of generosity of spirit that your paradigm doesn't have to be the paradigm, right? And they knew something else was coming. It's not like I made it up. There were people doing it first, but now you look at graduate education, and I assume this is probably true at Harvard too, that there's just almost everything is transnational, transregional, about flows, because we live in that moment, and that moment might be changing right in front of our eyes, right? Because we all read the news. So I would say it just as a very short answer, because again, I know we're short on time. It looks like Tom has a question too. So it would seem to me that the nation is what steps in to try to break that. And then as we move to other moments where the nation starts to break apart as being the most important way of organizing things, that changes again.
Let's have a final question then, and a brief response.
Thanks, and I'll try to be brief. So I find that your response very interesting, Eric, because I think I'm of a generation where I don't remember anything other than transnational is everything. Like I don't know of the before time when we didn't think about this. My question is about, I think it may be related to Dan's question about the juxtaposition of things that stay and things that move. And in my own, I've become interested in the Malay world and Malay history. And one of the things that is notable about how a political scientist reads the Malay world, or the history of the Malay world, and its politics is is the establishment of the concept of a Malay polity is itself foundationally tied to the notion of movement. Right? And so when you find, and you look at when I do my best to be a historian and read the original texts, I discover that the origins of the concept of Malacca are traced to Alexander the Great. And the origins of the concept of Kedah are traced to the Raja of Rum, which is the Emperor of Rome. And so there is no, in this model, there is no time in which a Malay polity is not a site of migration. There's no essence of it other than that. And I wonder how that might shape how we think about the things that we're talking about today.
I mean, that seems to me like a question for both of us.
Yeah, it was
actually.
for both of you, not just for Eric.
Yeah, and because there's a linguistic way, I think, of looking at this, and there might be a more kind of history-based, document-based way of looking at it. But that seems reasonable to me, that these polities, I mean, Malacca was probably one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world in the 16th century, right? Just people coming from everywhere. And you know, the kind of example I give when I'm teaching the pre-modern Southeast Asian history class, which is called Monsoon Kingdoms at Cornell, is you counterpost it to Srivijaya, the first great maritime empire of Southeast Asia, which existed from roughly the 7th to the 12th centuries. And what the Srivijayans did is to basically make the Straits of Malacca a kind of toll booth that anybody coming through had to pay very high duties, very high taxes to be able to trade. So anybody moving between these two great oceanic basins, the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, had to pay this kind of protection racket that was Srivijaya. And because of that, Srivijaya was not as cosmopolitan and not as, I would say, not as complex in some ways as the Malacca Sultanate, which comes after it. Because the Malacca Sultanate said, we're going to keep duties very low, we're going to keep taxes very low, but with the idea that we want as many people coming through as possible, and we're going to make money that way. And that really seems to have influenced these kind of Malay, what we call broader Malay polities in the Malay world. That might be Malaysia, Indonesia, southern Thailand, like Patani and places like that, even to the southern Philippines that Shugata was talking about before, in Mindanao and Sulu. So that becomes the kind of model for these oceanic city-states in Southeast Asia. They become these very, very cosmopolitan, sea-based, movement-based polities. And the great comparison there, which a number of scholars have done, is to the Mediterranean basin. When we think about Venice, Genoa, cities in southern France, some of the cities of Spain, of North Africa, even Alexandria, right? Alexandria is incredibly cosmopolitan. Cairo is not as cosmopolitan in that measure because it's not on the coast. So I don't know what Ronit would say to that. But.
I think, I mean, this is not exactly answering your questions, but thinking about the Malay and mobility, and I think it's interesting, you know, that on the one hand we have this idea of Malay as a lingua franca. I mean, that's part of what defines the way we think about this part of the world, right? The Indonesian Malay world, and Malay being a common language across great distances. So obviously it was moving around, it was changing constantly. And we can also look in these materials that I'm studying at how gradually, because of these translations, the Malay language was changing in very significant ways. So we can actually, like I said, because we have the original and translation on the same page, we can sort of trace how particular, in this case, particular Arabic words, but also prepositions, I mean, down to the really very small mechanics of language, tried to replicate the Arabic. And in that, they became sort of unidiomatic. The Malay that was being written in these manuscripts was not the sort of Malay that you would expect, but gradually, and this is something that was studied by Van Ronkel, the Dutch scholar, even in the late 19th century, he showed how there was a process of change through these translations, first in the written language, but then also religious written language, and then also into other forms of language and also speech. So this is another way of thinking about the movement of the language. Can I say one more word? I want you just mentioned that you're young enough to not remember the things being more separate and everything is transregional. I feel that we've come a long way, but we haven't gone forward enough in this respect. And I think we still have departments, we still have conferences and journals and publishers, series that very clearly distinguish between these world regions. And it's not always so easy to connect them. For example, in my university, I have a really hard time speaking to the people in Middle Eastern studies, about Indonesia, about Islam in Indonesia. They always seem not quite, interested or eager to know. So this is, not what we're doing. So just a comment in response to the earlier question. I think there's still a lot of work to do, and maybe here at your center, Southeast Asian Studies at Harvard, you can take that forward.
It is indeed a work in progress, but both of you, Ronit and Eric, have been exemplary in showing us what richly textured history of connections radiating out of Southeast Asia might look like. And I imagine the word kitab has been internalized in, South Asian and Southeast Asian languages. It is as much a Bengali word as an Arabic or a Persian word, and I suppose it's a Malay word too for book. Now, we have some wonderful panels that will follow. We will now have a 15-minute coffee break. I don't know whether the supply chain disruptions of recent times would have enabled us to have Mocha Java blend, which is my favorite cup of coffee. But in any case, I think we can have this psychoactive drink in order to come back rejuvenated for the next panels. Thank you very much.
Thank you.